Okay, hi guys. Hopefully everyone got on okay with the soils work that I set you from the live lesson last week. What I want to do today is just to take you through the next part of the syllabus. I will send you a separate email with some more instructions on. Anyway, the next part of the syllabus is the biogeochemical cycles. And basically, bio, remember, is living, geo is rocks, so it's really how chemicals are cycled through rocks and through living things and through the environment, hence bio, geo, chemical cycles. So there's three you need to know for the exam. So you need to know the phosphorus cycle, the carbon cycle, and the nitrogen cycle. Now the nitrogen cycle is probably the hardest one, and the way I normally teach it in class is with a sort of great big board diagram, and that's probably the easiest way to get your head around. If you just look at the diagrams in the textbook, it's quite hard to understand. You may have done it before, possibly at GCSE, but we'll probably be doing it in a bit more detail, and it does come up a lot in the exams. It's really important you understand it. So there is quite a nice PowerPoint on the Moodle site. I don't want you to look at too much of that, but you could certainly look at the first few slides about the biogeochemical cycles. And basically for each cycle, you need to know why it's important to living things, how the different forms of it are moved around, so the sort of main processes. You also need to know the human impacts, and then lastly, you need to know how we can manage the cycle more sustainably. So for example, if you think about nitrogen, if we don't manage it sustainably, let's say we let nitrates run off farmland into water, lakes and rivers, it can cause things like eutrophication. So managing the cycle successfully make sure that there's a future supply of these nutrients and elements for living things, but also make sure that we reduce pollution as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw out in a minute on a whiteboard a kind of big diagram of the nitrogen cycle, and I'd like you to try and kind of draw it at the same time. So if you want to grab some paper, ideally kind of, if you've got A3, that'd be brilliant. If you've only got A4, that's fine, but you'll need to keep your writing quite small, and it works best in landscape rather than portrait. So I'm going to move the camera around in a second, and I'm going to focus in on the whiteboard. So just bear with me a second while I move the camera around. Okay, we're getting there. Just bear with me. Okay, hopefully that's reasonably sort of central. So what you can see here is this diagram is in cross section. So this is the soil underground. Over here we've got some sort of crop growing. We've also got some plants over here. We've also got a lake or a pond. This is the atmosphere. So we're going to start off with nitrogen gas in the atmosphere. So the form of nitrogen gas in the atmosphere is of course N2. Okay, so that's nitrogen gas, and hopefully you guys remember what percent of the atmosphere that is, and that's 78% of the atmosphere. So you might be sort of thinking, well, why are we worrying about cycling nitrogen if there's such a high proportion of nitrogen in the atmosphere? And the reason that you have to cycle nitrogen is that nitrogen in that form is inert. Okay, so it's not available for living things to be able to use. So we need to put it into a form of nitrogen that can be used by living things. Nitrogen is very important for things like amino acids, for protein manufacture, DNA, things like that. So the way that nitrogen is converted into other forms, one way is with ionizing events. So that's a fancy name for things like lightning strikes. So you could put a sort of bolt of lightning on your diagram, and at very high temperatures, in a lightning bolt, it makes atmospheric nitrogen, N2, combine with oxygen to make nitrous oxide. You might remember us talking about nitrous oxide when we did some of the greenhouse gases. So that's actually fixed nitrogen, and that can actually be sort of rained down into the soils as sort of nitric acid in rainfall and things like that. So that's one way in which nitrogen can be put into the soils in a form that can be used by living things. The other way, or most of the other ways, involve bacteria, and that's the nasty thing about the nitrogen cycle, is there are lots and lots of names of bacteria you've got to try to remember. So the first one, we're going to have an arrow going over to this part of the diagram. So some nitrogen ends up into soil. If you think about soil having air within it, we talked about aeration of soils, so soil does have air within it. And within soils there are natural, what we call nitrogen fixing bacteria. So I'm going to write that on, nitrogen fixing, this is really hard to write on actually. So nitrogen fixing bacteria. Now some are naturally found within the soil. Things like, I'm going to write on here, azotobacter. A-Z-O-T-O bacter. So there are natural, freely living nitrogen-fixing bacteria just found within the soil, like for example Azotobacter. Now most of the nitrogen-friendly bacteria in the soil that are important for the nitrogen cycle are aerobic, so you get more of these if you have oxygen available in the soil. Anyway, that's Azotobacter. Now next to Azotobacter you can see I've drawn a plant that's got these very strange root nodules on. You might remember from the field trip to Cornwall we talked about legumes. Legumes are nitrogen-fixing crops, things like clover, and they spray those onto the spoil heaps down in Cornwall. Anyway, so this is a legume here, so this is a nitrogen-fixing, or a crop that has nitrogen-fixing bacteria found in its root nodules. It's a sort of symbiotic relationship. The plant produces the root nodules for the bacteria to live in, and the bacteria obviously provide the plant with nitrogen. So legumes, things like peas and beans and clover, they have these nitrogen-fixing bacteria in their root nodules, and a good example would be one called Rhizobium. Okay, that's a really well-known nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So we've got Azotobacter, which are freely living nitrogen-fixing bacteria found in the soil, and we've got the sort of nitrogen-fixing bacteria that are found in root nodules. Okay, and those produce ammonia. Okay, so we've got ammonia here, and what you do need to know for the nitrogen cycle is the names of the different forms. So ammonia is NH3+, and that dissolves into the soil moisture. So it goes from being NH3 plus ammonia, it dissolves into the soil moisture to become ammonium. Okay, and that's NH4+. Alright, now there's another way in which you can get ammonia and ammonium into the soil, and that's through the decomposition of living things. So if you want on your diagram, you can draw a little food chain, you can draw some little animals, have a little food chain here. Obviously nitrogen is passing along the food chain in the form of things like proteins and amino acids, but animals of course excrete, animals also die, so excretion and dead animals decomposing can also work their way down to this part of the nitrogen cycle, and this process is called ammonification. So the ammonification. So things like excretion, animal wastes, decaying dead animals, decomposition, all those things work their way down dead organic matter into the soil. So you could put a DOM here, so dead organic matter, and ammonification, and that's going down into that store there. Okay, so we can see quite a few sort of stores at the moment. We've got a sort of store of atmospheric nitrogen here. We've now got a store in the form of sort of dead organic matter. We've got stores of nitrogen actually in living things, in the animals and crops and things. That's another store. And we've also got sort of stores down here in the form of ammonium and ammonia. Okay, now can crops take up ammonium? Well, they can. So if you want, you could draw a sort of field of wheat over here the farmer might be growing, and we can have a sort of dotted arrow going up to these plants, and that's uptake. Okay, so plants can take up nitrogen in the form of ammonium. It's not as soluble as some other forms, but it can be taken up, which is why I put it as a sort of dotted line rather than a really thick line, because although it can be taken up in that form, it's not as soluble and as easily taken up as other forms. Now the next bit of the diagram is along the bottom, and I'm just going to double check that you can see the bottom of the diagram as I'm drawing that out. I'm just going to adjust the camera a little bit. Okay, it looks like maybe some of that you couldn't quite see. There we go. Okay, so we've got ammonium down here. So there are some very important bacteria involved in this part of the cycle, and they're called nitrifying bacteria. So these, remember, were nitrogen fixing bacteria over here, but along the bottom are nitrifying bacteria. Okay, I'm kind of struggling a bit with space here, and it's a two-stage process. So these nitrifying bacteria first of all convert the ammonium into nitrite, and then they convert the ammonium into nitrate. So nitrite first and nitrate second. So nitrite is NO2 minus, nitrate is NO3 minus. Okay, so nitrite NO2 minus, nitrate NO3 minus. Okay, so those are called nitrifying bacteria. I'm going to get rid of that because I'm running out of space a little bit. Obviously, hopefully you've got a bit more room on your diagram. So these are nitrifying bacteria. Okay, nitrifying bacteria. And the process is called nitrification. Okay, so nitrogen fixation over here. Nitrogen fixation done by nitrogen fixing bacteria. This is nitrifying bacteria doing nitrification. Okay, and you can see oxygen here, NO2 plus, NO3 plus, so these are aerobic bacteria. Now, you do again need to know the names of these bacteria. So the ones that convert the ammonium to nitrite are things like nitrosomonas. Okay, so nitrosomonas, okay. And then the ones that convert the nitrite to nitrate are things like nitrobacter. Okay, so nitrosomonas and nitrobacter, and how well you can read there, Nitrobacter, nitrobacter. Okay, now that's a very important process because when you get it into the form of nitrate, this is very, very soluble. It's very easily taken up by plants. So on the board diagram, I know I'm doing class, I have a really, really thick arrow of uptake here going up to these plants, so uptake of nitrate. So really easily absorbed, really easily taken up by plants, really important for crop production, etc. The downside, of course, if something's very, very soluble, is of course it can be easily leached. So what you can do in this corner is you can have an arrow going down here and you can label on that arrow leaching. So that leaching is a name for when something is removed, dissolved in water. So I can't really write this, I'm trying to hold the board at the same time, but you could have a little arrow saying leaching down into groundwater, and that could be very bad news because that can contaminate drinking water and aquifers and things like that. So leaching, loss there. Alright, so that is nearly all of the nitrogen cycle. Now, of course, with all cycles it has to balance. There has to be some way of getting the nitrogen at the moment is all going into the soil. So how does it go back to the atmosphere so the whole cycle balances out? And this is the last part of the diagram. And this is where nitrogen that's found in soils in the form of things like nitrate goes back to the atmosphere. And the process for that is called denitrification. Okay, denitrification. And you can probably guess the name of the bacteria that do it. They're called denitrifying bacteria. So denitrifying bacteria carrying out the process of denitrification. Okay, a good example of that, and again you need to know the names of these bacteria, is one called Pseudomonas. 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 And again you can write on this process, also on the name of the bacteria, denitrifying bacteria, E.g. Pseudomonas, and the process is denitrification, and that returns nitrogen back to the atmosphere. And that is the nitrogen cycle. So it sort of sounds complicated, and it is quite complicated, but it's much easier if you kind of write up and slowly kind of draw the diagram as a process. So I'm just going to bring the camera back just for a second. Oops, let's do that. Okay, so right, so that's the nitrogen cycle. So just to run through it very quickly again. So atmospheric store of nitrogen in the atmosphere, it's inert, it's not available to living things. So the nitrogen cycle is all about putting it into forms that can be used by living things. There's really only three parts, well, 3 or 4 processes. The first one, remember, was nitrogen fixation by nitrogen fixing bacteria. You had ammonification by ammonifying bacteria. That was the one with the dead organic matter and animal wastes. Along the bottom of the diagram, you've got nitrogen nitrification by nitrifying bacteria, and then the last part of the diagram is the denitrification by denitrifying bacteria. Okay, I know it's a lot to remember. Have a go at drawing the diagram. Okay, see how you get on. Have a read of the textbook, and I'll give you a few more instructions with the email that I send out with this video. Cheers, guys.